Be able to play every musical instrument or be the master of one.
That's easy. That's absolutely easy. I don't have room in my house to have a double bass and an oboe and a timpani, but I would love to be the master of one. Even if my foot is cramped in little shoes. And what was the other thing that was going on with me? I am dancing everywhere. Oh, okay. So it needs to be an instrument where I can dance. So I don't think it's actually drums. I think it's like, is it guitar? Just master the guitar? That's quite a boring answer, though. I don't know, Shem. Shem, over to you.
So I've been playing guitar and bass for quite a few years, and I'm still yet to master them. So I don't think I could ever master an instrument. So for me, I would love to be able to play like a little bit of piano, a little bit of drums, like just enough to understand and like to help with writing would be awesome. So I would choose diversity over being specialized, I think, for this one.
You just have so many party tricks just ready to go. Like someone just pulls out a harmonica and you're like, yo, send it my way. I can do a little bit of ukulele right now. So I'd have ukulele plus mastering one instrument. That'd be pretty cool.
Did you just say ukulele?
Ukulele.
Is that how it's pronounced?
Well, that's how I pronounce it.
I've always said ukulele. All right, big discussion time.
I think, like, if you had to master one instrument, though, it would be pianoforte, right?
Piano.
Would it?
Yeah. It's, like, so intense, I reckon. It's, like, I think it's, like, really hard to be a master at the piano.
There's a few things actually going on here, right? One is that, like, how hard is this instrument to master, and essentially how many free level ups you're getting, which is, like, that's one factor. No one's going to say the triangle because there's not many free level ups. But then there's the like practicality thing for songwriting and stuff, and piano or guitar, clearly very, very helpful for that. But then there's the cool factor. And I'm sorry, piano doesn't get that many marks in the cool factor.
Well, obviously you'd play the bass for the cool factor, right?
No way. Like when I was in bands playing bass, no one talked to me. There's always the singer, maybe the guitarist, and definitely the drummer. That's the cool factor stuff. The bass player gets ignored most of the time.
And that's why you started playing guitar, right?
Exactly, yeah. For more cool.
I'd see those people on YouTube who are like able to play a bunch of instruments and they just record songs by themselves.
Yeah, that's what I would love to have, just like the ability to do that if I wanted to. Not that I could, just to know that I could, but I can't. But you get the gist.
You don't have time, but if you did, you would be able to.
I feel like that's the solo gamer's answer. You've just gone with the solo board gamer's answer. Like, I'll do it all myself. I don't need a band.
Exactly.
I think I would want to, as I said, master the piano because I think I've always wished I was able to play it properly. Yeah, I just think it's such a beautiful instrument when you hear people who are seriously good at playing it. Like, I know a lot of people can play the piano, but when you hear people that are seriously good, it's just like, whoa.
Yeah, it sounds like they've got 3 or 4 hands, right? Like, I just don't believe it. It's crazy.
That'll be next week's question. Welcome to the Lens and Veil podcast. Join Shem, Sam, and Zach as they dive into a designer-focused analysis of Skara Brae, again from our own Shem Phillips.
So this week on the podcast, the guys thought it would be fun for us to talk about my upcoming game, Skara Brae. This is my love letter, I guess, in a way to resource management. So this game has a ton of different resources. It's set in sort of ancient Neolithic Scotland in the Orkney Islands. It's all about surviving, finding new people to join your settlement, clothing them, sheltering them, and feeding them, all over the course of course, 4 rounds where the most points wins. You guys have both played this, obviously, and recently as well, just for a refresher. We're going to dive into a bit about what the game is like, the journey of designing it, and all that kind of stuff.
Shem, I have a first question to ask you about your design journey with Skara Brae. Where did the mechanical design come from? Where did the theme come from? How did you decide to do a game about a settlement 5,000 years ago in Scotland? And how were you wanting players to feel when they played the game?
Just a few small questions to get it started. Nice. All right, so for those who don't know, we have this line of games called the Ancient Anthology. So we've done our medieval games over the last few years, most people know us for those games, the North Sea trilogy, the West Kingdom, South Tigris, and the upcoming East Empire. But our other line of games, our main line of games beside that, is the Ancient Anthology. So we've done Raiders of Scythia, Hadrian's Wall, Legacy of You, Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the upcoming The Anarchy and Skara Brae, and more to come down the line as well. I think ever since we did, I think Hadrian's Wall is probably where it sort of sparked the idea of let's do a series out of this. I've always been on the lookout for cool stories in history, like things to talk about, or just stories that people don't know and they're interesting and there's a good game under that kind of story. I've got this big list of like kind of civs or stories in history that I'm interested in. And Skara Brae was one that stood out to me because it's crazy that it's still there today. You can go visit this place. It's 5,000 years old.
Wow.
It's all, broken down. The roofs are gone and stuff, but you can walk around, you can look inside and stuff, which is pretty amazing. And just the story of these people who basically, like, in a way, hoarded everything. I don't know the exact details of what they did, but they kind of collected all their trash, their waste, bones and broken tools and all that kind of stuff. They just piled it up into piles. And in archaeology, it's known as Midden piles. It's all around the world, often with shells. It's quite common. So I believe in Australia, there's tons of Midden piles, which are all shells. Curious about that one as well. Anyway, they created these Midden piles rather than just kind of discarding it into the ocean or something. They made these piles of land. And then over 100, 200 years or whatever, this land or this kind of massive waste becomes actual land, essentially, breaks down and stuff. And they dug into these big mounds they had built, and they built their homes inside these mounds, which is pretty crazy. There's about, I think there's 10 rooms, be wrong, that could be up to 12-ish rooms at Skara Brae, and most of them are all connected through small tunnels. So each room was very small, had like 2 beds, one for the men, one for the females on each side. They had a shelf, which is kind of bizarre and kind of a nice little nod to board gamers. The shelf at the center point of their room where they put their ornaments, these stone balls they sculpted and other things. And in the middle was this cooking, the oven, the hearth where they'd cook their food, and the smoke would rise up out of the middle of these coverings for their roofs. So at night time, it would have been so dark in these places because they're all covered. But they'd have their fire going and a little tunnel system, and it's pretty amazing when you look into it. Like even just for like security and stuff, there's these tunnel systems with like shadows and all sorts going on. So pretty amazing. The other thing that kind of I found interesting was that there was no signs of combat or any kind of violence going on at this place. From all we can tell from looking at the sites, they were very peaceful. They were just a good community trying to survive. So it's quite a nice nod to more modern culture, I guess, where people are far more, trying to get along. So that's kind of the history or the setting that I found, which I found very interesting. And then mechanically, it was more about, well, what would the game be about? And with a bit of research, I found there were tons of different food types they used or resources they gathered and all sorts. There was the red deer, there's fish, there was sheep, there were cows, all sorts. They even harvested barley, which was like centuries or millennia before they believed that agriculture was a thing. And it's quite interesting to look into like the history of these places now, that what was thought to be like the start of agriculture is often proven wrong by other sites they find more recently. So this is one of those cool sites. So I kind of jotted down all the things, like the different resources that they may gather, and then I had this big list. So this is probably going to be a resource management game, most likely. And I love resourcey games. So, but yeah, that's kind of where it started out with the theming and with the general thing of like, this is probably going to be a resource game. It's gone through a lot of different versions, which I guess we'll get to in the podcast. But as far as like the feelings I wanted to create or the kind of general overview of the game, it's hard to say where I kind of started with that. I'm not too sure. I was definitely riffing a bit on a similar design space to, say, Legacy of You and the new Shipwrights Redux. So more in that kind of solo space, very thinky, but not too heavy, and just kind of the puzzle of figuring out the optimal moves at the right time. That's the kind of feelings I wanted with that. Players like basically feeling smart by pulling off cool sequences and things like that. Yeah, that's kind of how it all got started.
Yeah, sometimes when designing games, like I might not have the answer to all of those questions. I'm a strong believer that there are multiple origin points. And then one of the really hard things about game design is bringing all those together, right? Bringing the mechanical ideas together, the core hook, how players win, what players are feeling as they're playing, and also the thematic tie-ins with the setting and stuff. But sometimes you can just come up with a mechanism and try it out and then answer that question of feeling after the fact, like, oh, whoa, like that was a really interesting puzzle, or whoa, I love that feeling of swimming in resources. Can we ramp that up? And then you see something that's working or has potential to work, and then you just go hard to make it shine more than some of the other stuff that's going on. Shem, do you have a hard time like bringing kind of all these different things, this mechanics and the theme together, or does it just kind of happen seamlessly for you?
It's definitely work, I guess, like any game design. I actually, just to throw to Bobby Hill a bit, I've really enjoyed watching his process where he basically does this big map of every element that could be in the game. He kind of like categorizes them. These could be resources, these could be tracks, these could be this and that. And he kind of has this big flow diagram. I'm not that advanced, but I love seeing that process for him. And perhaps other designers are like that as well, where they kind of get every little bit and try and put it in a spot mechanically, I guess, is the way, and how things can tie together. For this one, as you're speaking, I was thinking through the process a bit more. And for this one, a big part of my, I guess, focus to get the mechanical thing working with the theme was about this idea of like cleaning up the waste. So the original version I had for this game, the very first version, was using polyominoes, and you're basically building this almost like a tower of polyominoes. So you might take an action which gives you a cow. So you get this big. It was like I think it was like a 3x2 rectangle cow, and you'd put it on your board, and then you'd choose to cook the cow, and then you'd flip it over, and it would show you the resources that it provided. And there'd be some blank spots which would basically represent waste. I think it was something like to that extent. I think you were putting tokens on top to show the midden being placed over things as you spent them, and it was kind of fun. We played it on TTS a bit, but I went ahead and ordered this like prototype from the game crafter, a few $100 worth of tiles, and then set it up, played it for a few seconds. It's like, this is just not practical. Like, no way could you play this game with your fingers like knocking everything over. So I had to change the format after that one. But it had that first thing of like, you gain resources, and then when you're using them, they're creating not only good stuff but also some waste that you have to manage.
It's funny, Shem, because I believe there were several impractical prototypes of this game. Is that right?
They were all very practical. And the next version was actually like, it was all cards. So if you say gained a piece of stone, a stone, you would gain the stone card and you place it in front of you. If you spend that stone, you wouldn't return it to the pile, you'd flip it over, and that would show that it's waste. And then if you gain some barley, you'd gain the barley and you put it on top of that old piece of stone which is flipped over, because it's a little pile of midden you're creating. And she'd basically get all these cards. It was this kind of accordion-like thing where you'd like, the more you gain, if you have a spot to put it, you could. Otherwise, you create a new spot. And there was an action to basically push all these piles together to create one big pile of waste, which you then put a roof on top of. And that was cool. And it felt fun, like kind of cleaning up this big like tableau of waste in front of you. But the game needed about 1,600 cards. And I could just hear the voices of the reviewers in my head going, this game is so horrible to set up. This game is even worse to pack down. I could just hear it. And I was fighting against it. But yeah, that was the second version. And I went through different versions of switching out the cards for wooden tokens, then back to the cards again, and then eventually landed on what we have now, which is using the kind of the slider, the resource track, where you manage your resources to get that same feeling of kind of growth and then pull it back down again.
Yeah, that was something that I found super unique with that card version. Like, it actually kind of worked, but there were clearly some issues and stuff, but it kind of worked, and it did bring about, speaking of player feelings, it brought about this feeling of like how you feel when you vacuum a dirty spot and then it's all just disappears. You just feel like such a nice tidy Kiwi, and that was such a unique feeling. I don't know if I've had that feeling in a game where it's like everything's a mess and then you bring it all together like through the game's mechanisms, and you're getting rewarded for doing so. Do you think there's scope for a game that does something similar in the future?
Probably. I mean, one of the funniest things is like hearing people play tests going, I just wish I could clean more. Like things you would never say in reality. It's just always funny to me, like people trying to do that. So yeah, I don't know. It's a strange mechanism, I think, the idea of trying to manage your production, like, because in the game having stuff is great, but there is a cost to having too much stuff. And I'm sure there are other games out there, maybe some people who are listening could point them out, that do the similar thing, or at least touching on the same thematic kind of vibe of like, have stuff but not too much stuff. It's definitely been done in games where there's like a hard limit, like you can hold 8 things and no more, and then you discard down. That's definitely a thing in a lot of games. But the idea of like, you can have as much as you like, but there will be consequences. Maybe there's some other games that do it. Yeah,
so speaking of all these resources, there are a lot in this game, and actually when people have seen the photos, they've been like, I hope there's an insert, I hope there's an insert. And thankfully, Folded Space have created an insert, which will be available. So how did you come up with the right number of resources? How did you decide what was too much and what was too few?
My memory is so bad, but I believe from very early on, there were like 4 kind of environments of the game. So you're gaining settlers, and they'd help you gather resources in one of the 4 environments. So we had the shore, we had the hills, we had the thickets, the woods, and then the farm, kind of the fields. So at the very bare minimum, I think I had shells. The limpet shells are a very common food source for them. In the hills, we had gathering rocks for making tools and all sorts, and building the homes. In the thickets, we had getting wood, gathering, but they didn't have too many forests on Skara Brae, but they had, a few trees here and there. And then would have been driftwood as well, actually. And then they were doing the barley kind of thing as well. So there was kind of like, there's definitely going to be these 4 basic gathering resources. And then there had to be animals as well. So I think I tied the cows to the fields. We can put the deer in the thickets. Then we can put the sheep in the hills. And then there's fish in the shore. So it's like, there's 8 resources done. All right. So what happens when you cook a fish? Well, you get some bones and some food. So there's 2 more resources. And then you've got the pelts or the hides from the animals, the cows and the deers and stuff. So they kind of just ballooned a bit like, there's this, this, this. And eventually I added in seaweed and wool as other resources, just to kind of give a bit more to the shore and the hills, I guess. Yeah, because the deer and the cows, they're on the other side of there's kind of the 4 areas on the 2 right-hand side are very strong. Like, get a lot of stuff out of those areas. You can get tons of food, tons of bones and pelts. So I want to give a bit more, and also just to bring in a few more resources. And that was mostly, I think the main driving force for that was there are 10 actions in the game. And to flip over these action tiles you have, the top row is always a stone, the bottom row is always a bone, but then there's another resource you spend, and they're tied to the columns. So the left ones, I'm going to probably forget what they are, but it's like, I think the left one is always, I think it's wood. So it's like stone and wood for the top left, bone and wood for the bottom left. And it's always a resource that doesn't belong to that area as well. So when I had like these kind of, I think I had 8 actions originally, maybe at some point. And that was working fine. But then I was like, I'll do one more action. Like, how about a trade action or something? So I need another resource that you use to flip that tile over. So I kind of needed to have like just enough resources to kind of tick all these boxes. And then it's about finding other uses for them as well. So when you're cleaning up and creating roofs for your homes, there's like 4 different resources you can use there. When you're furnishing, there's a resource you can use there. Use that, or pelts or wool to do the actions. So it was about giving multiple uses for each resource. So when I gather a shell, there's 3 places I could use it, and that's really important in resource management games.
So I'm just looking at it now, and I've counted 16 unique wooden pieces that are resources that are held on your player board in your resource area. And I would normally say this is far too many for a game to have this many in the game. But I think you've solved that problem in several ways that is really clever. One of the things is that this isn't a recipe fulfillment game. So you're not here looking at a card in your hand like an architect's saying, I need a cow and 3 wheat and a wool to fulfill this recipe, right? And if you had that kind of thing, there would be a feeling of frustration that you might not be able to get the thing that you want when you want it. But the other thing is that, like, there are, say, like with the animals, they are all fulfilling a similar function in that they are a different way of producing food, bones, pelts, maybe wool. And so the player can kind of decide which of these is going to be their source of food. And it means that you've got this cool piece, and they look different, and they thematically have like coherence for where you get them from, but it's not actually taking up too much of your brain space, like thinking of deer and cows as complete different entities. They kind of function the same way. And having all the costs in front of you on your player board, and you don't have to use any of them, but you could, I think is a really nice way of actually making the resource gathering not overwhelming, but crunchy and fun, and really accessible.
Yeah, and that actually comes from the very first tile version. From memory, it had cows, it had deer for sure. They were different shaped polyominoes, basically. I think we had the 3x2, the 2x2. I think we had like a fish that was like a L shape. We had, I think it was a rat in that point, which was like a 3x1. And I think there was like a bunny as well or something. So that came from that very first version with having different animals or different creatures, food types, or different polyomino shapes. Because it was simple, you had the different shape, which has to be hard to place. But then when you flip it over, it gives you basically, you see the same kind of stuff that you're already getting anyway. So that's kind of where it came from, which is interesting that it stuck around that long.
Yeah.
Like an old mechanical version carried through for that. It wasn't like I set out with this original version and thought, no, I'll have all these animals, like with different resource types. Those types came from those polyomino shapes. Maybe
that we can like throw to a more general question on this conversation around resources, and that maybe for all of us to talk about is how do you decide the right number of resources to put in your game? Like, say it's a worker placement game or a different style of game. Like in Architects, we've got the 5 resources plus coins. Like, how do you land on on the right number of resources for a game. And I think this is actually a really important thing to figure out, because if you've got too many, it can be really stressful, or not stressful, frustrating for the player.
I'm curious to hear you guys, maybe Zach, about Chaos Order, because Chaos Order has 3 resources. You got your energy, your gems, and your cards. But gems is actually more like a premium energy in a way, how you use it. So, but it creates a nice gate for how hard it is to get that resource.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that cards as well, people don't think of them necessarily as a resource in a way, like the players playing the game. They don't think about the card in the same way as the energy and the gems, when effectively it is. And the 3 main harvest spots are card, gem, 2 energy, right? I've actually had some thoughts about this recently, about ways to streamline Chaos Order even more. And one of my thoughts was about taking away gems and how you could do that. Like, I think it's important in the game to have that kind of that special resource or that gate, but is it worth having an extra resource, was the question that I had in my head. And maybe in a game that's 2 to 4 hours, it's okay, but I was having some thoughts about how could I make a game like Chaos Order still be as fun, or almost as fun, and be kind of a 60 to 90 minute game. And I think in that case I'd have to take out one of the resources, because I think in that context having an extra resource is just more stuff to think about, and it's going to cause more AP. It's going to cause more people getting frustrated about not having the right things. So I think in that case, I think in Chaos Order it's good having the gems. If the game was shorter, I don't think it would be as good.
So Sam, when I think you first showed me your first prototype for Architects, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's definitely silver coins. That was a big thing in the game. I think it was just stone, wood, and gold. Is that right from your memory?
That's right. There was stone, wood, and gold. And the first action you would take at the mines would get you nothing. There was still that same system around, every 2 workers at the mines gets you a gold. And I was leaning into this worker investment thing for balance and stuff. But your first worker literally got you nothing. There was not clay, there was not marble. And Shen came along and decided to add those 2 resources, which was a brilliant, brilliant idea.
Well, I think the reasoning behind adding 2 more resources to that game, one was for the recipe fulfillment on the cards, so we can have a wider variety of costs for each card. Another element was to have 2 premium resources, so gold and marble act a bit like the gems in Chaos Order. They're harder to get, and they can kind of gate those bigger buildings a bit. I think the other one was actually the black market, so that we'd have more variety on the black market. Otherwise, it's like, I'll just go there and get gold and wood and stone. Like, that's it. So having like a marble resource that was hard to get anywhere else kind of improved the game as well.
Yeah, for sure. The marble was like kind of my favorite, I guess it's my favorite resource in that game, because when I'm teaching new players, they ask, oh, where can I get marble? And I tell them, well, you can get it here at the King's Storehouse. It's going to take you quite a few actions. You're not going to get much of it, and you're going to have to spend all these other resources. It's inefficient, but this is the noble or the virtuous way to get it. But here, I'll look over here. You could go to the black market. And a lot of new players are kind of averse to this idea of dropping their virtue track, being in the negative point zone, even though they can get out of it. And it was a really cool way of making this resource, which isn't inherently bad, but easier to get if you cut corners and play an unvirtuous game. So it's encouraging players to experiment and dip their feet in, because eventually they're going to need marble for some of these cards in their hand, and they could be really inefficient and do it through the King's Storehouse way, or they could find another way to acquire it.
I don't know if you guys agree, but I think as a designer with less experience and a newer designer than you guys, I think one of the easiest things as a new designer is to just chuck in heaps of resources. I'd be like, oh, there's a resource for this, there's a resource for that, there's a resource for that. And that's definitely, I think, if we're talking about Chaos Order again in early designs, we were designing it as a sequel to First Light, which had a whole bunch of resources because it was one of those sort of games, resource management game. And so I also had even more resources in the first prototypes, and we had to take some of them out. And so I guess as I've gained more experience, what I've realized is each resource needs to have a reason and a clear identity, a reason for being there and a clear identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the last resources to get added to Skara Brae was the scale knives. And that's kind of quite an oddball resource. Most of the other things are about getting the stuff to do the thing. And then you got food, you've got Midden, are the 2 other kind of big resources. Well, Midden's not really a resource, it's a necessity. But scale knives were interesting to me because it's basically a rough piece of stone that they used a lot in ancient times to cut things before they had actual knives. So it was a way to bring in a resource which helped a bit with mitigation. So you could have this resource that if you needed more of a certain thing at a certain time, when gaining a certain settler, you could use that premium, or not really premium, but this kind of strange resource to gain more of that thing. So it acts a bit like a wild, but only when gathering. And I was able to then use that resource in other areas. So the main way is when you trade, you can use one scale knife to gain like an extra thing when you trade. And that was really the two reasons. One is, like I said, about the mitigation. So it kind of softens the edges of the resource management for some players. So if they just can't get, like, say, wood in the game, they're not really gathering from the area. It's hard to go in there, and then to invest in their late game is kind of like, what's the point? I get 1 wood, which they've gathered up like 3 or 4 scale knives. Now they go and grab like 4 or 5 wood. So that helps those players pivot a little bit. But the other reason was mostly thematic. Like, this is a thing that they would have used a lot in that place, and I wanted to bring in that resource almost purely for that reason. Like, I want this in the game, and that was for a lot of the things in that game as well. So, all the animals we talked about and stuff as well. So often it's the thematic reason you want them in the game.
This whole idea of like resources having their identity and us loving resource management but wanting to do it in unique ways is something that we're really challenging ourselves to keep thinking about and pressing into in our designs. Like inventors, for example, there were a lot of different ways that we went about making the early prototypes for inventors, but we wanted to make these really cool devices with like thread and like candles and like metal and woodwork and all that sort of stuff. And so some of the early prototypes for inventors had all of these different resources, but when we actually like figured out that we had something, when we were like, yes, this is a eureka moment, was when we realized that actually the resources could just be coins. And essentially your resources are your craftspeople that you're paying to do the work for you, and they all have their cost essentially to pay, and then they essentially get work experience. They level up and they're worth more points as you pay them. They start costing more because they've got all that work experience. But once we solved that, there was like a really interesting take on resource management, because are those 6 craftspeople, are they resources? Are they not? Is it just coins? You're using the same resource to pay each of them, but it gave like a really unique feel to the game. And one other area where Shem and I are experimenting with this is a game that we're working on currently, and we've sort of challenged ourselves to make it only one resource in the game, essentially only one resource in the game. We played an early prototype that I think, Shem, there might have been 3 or 4 different resources, like cards and coins and some tokens. And then we were like, what if we just took out the coins and the tokens? And
it was great. You got to try stuff. That's the big thing about it. With good game design. You've got to just experiment. Like, does the game get better or worse if you add a resource or take one away? Or does it make any difference at all? Or is it just about your choice, your taste? And often, like, when you're thinking about game design as a product, it's also about like what other cool things are in the game. So the fact there are so many resources in Skara Brae is kind of a selling point of the game. It's like, look at all those cool custom meeples. Whereas a game that has no resources, it's all about cards or something. Like that's the thing about the game. It's an easy setup. Lots of variability because the cards are all unique. But it's really about like, what is not just the design, not just the feeling of the game, but the product, like the table presence or the presentation. Like tons of stuff to consider. And whether or not to add or remove a resource might not actually make any difference to their gameplay, but it might to one of the other 2 areas.
One of the mechanisms that is used in a ton of modern board games, like it's nearly in every modern Euro game I feel that I play, is set collection. And this is actually something that stands out to me for Skara Brae, where I think it's done one of the best I've ever seen. And it's not that obvious that it's set collection, but these cards that you draft and that you are tucking below their own environment and getting to gather as many times as you have cards in that column is very, very cool. Because firstly, if you just gather a bunch of cards of the same environment, you could, for example, I love to gather heaps of wheat. I love to just take wheat card, wheat card, wheat card. Every time you take one, you get to trigger all of them for their tags. It's kind of like Architect's Worker Investment, right? So by the time I've got my 5th wheat card, I've gathered 15 wheat over the course of those 5 turns. So I love that you give people the opportunity to just absolutely swim in resources. And that feels really powerful, feels really broken. But there are 2 ways, or kind of 3 ways, that you balance that out. One way is that there's not a lot you can do with just one type of resource. There are a few things you can, I think it's called trade. You can trade with a bunch of them, which is cool. But you want to diversify your resource pool so that you can do more things. You can spend them to flip your equipment and things like that. The second thing is that if you generate that many resources, you're also going to be generating a lot of waste, which is a really cool push and pull. You allow the player that player fantasy of just generating a ton of stuff, but they're going to have to deal with their waste, and that's going to come back to bite them if they don't at the end of the game. But the third thing you do is you create a horizontal incentive as well as the vertical incentive for your card tucking. And that is, I think it's the Furnish mechanic, where you can gain points for completing rows and having rows of people in your settlement. So you sort of want to have people in every environment, not only to diversify the resources, but to score more points at the end of the game. And this is a balance of multiple incentives of stacking a column versus stacking a row that I think is done better than most set collection games.
Oh, thanks, Sam. So kind of you to say. We do this a lot in our games, though. And often, Sam will do it or want to do it in a game. So, for example, in Viscounts, we have the reason to go heavy onto one type of manuscript. Like if you rush getting all the blue manuscripts, you'll get the nice little trade bonus card. But if you go horizontal, then you're scoring points having sets. So we do that a lot in our games, having both motivations. What I like about it in games is that a few turns in, let's say I've got in Skara Brae, I've got like 3 cards for wheat, and I've got like 1 wood and say 1 in the shore. So I'm lacking 1 in the forest, in the thickets, but I'm kind of leaning more towards the fields. Whatever cards come out in the offer, there's a lot of different decisions based on those cards. Like, do I want to finish a row? Is getting that extra water card, the sea card now better because it gives me a fish and I really want a fish to get the bones? Or do I want to just keep pushing on the barley? So I just love it when games give, every player has a different value for whatever's on the offer. It's not just like, this is the best card for everybody. It's based on what you already have in front of you. And that's always good to have in games where there's kind of like different paths of players going down different ways, makes things different. And then you can look at your opponent and say, hey, they really want that thing. Now do I deny that thing? Like there's always different layers that you have to decide around what's available.
That's just made me think about how in a weird way we did that in Chaos Order as well. We're like, everyone wants something different from the map state. And so it makes that interesting thought about not everyone wants the same thing as you. What does everyone else want? Do I want to get what I want, or do I want to deny someone from getting what they want if they're too far ahead? So
Skara Brae has a significant portion of the game that is simultaneous play. We've seen this also, Shem, in Shipwrights of the North Sea, not your design, but in Hadrian's Wall, also in the Anarchy now coming out too. Is it safe to say that this is something that Garphill likes to do and will do more of? Why do we keep going to this simultaneous play experience?
So as a player, I don't often look for a lot of player interaction. I don't mind player interaction. It doesn't turn me off a game, but I don't necessarily need it to enjoy the game, if that makes sense. Whereas some people really want it. They need it in a game. If there's no interaction, they're like, what's the point of playing this game? I may as well do a jigsaw. And for me, I'm like, I love doing jigsaws. Let's do puzzles. I like doing puzzles. So that's kind of my play style. I love little things to figure out, to solve the thing. I love problem solving. My whole life, always enjoyed that kind of stuff, like figuring out the little pattern and trying to recognize what needs to be fixed or changed or whatever. So I love that as a player. As far as like as a designer, I guess I was just in a space for most of these games for the last few years of like, I just want to make games that I enjoy, even as a solo gamer. I don't know if it was because of the pandemic and stuff, where it's like you kind of want to play games quickly by yourself. Who knows? I don't know what influenced it, but some of the games we're working on now aren't in this vein at all. They're far more interactive. So kind of just go through motions, I guess, as a designer. Like you're kind of discovering a certain space, you're figuring out how to design in that space, then you kind of move on for a bit. Maybe you come back. But it's fair to say most of our games on the Garphill line lean more towards this like player focused or player kind of puzzle focused line, I guess is the way to say it. Like,
yeah,
we like games to burn your brain, I guess is the other way to put it. But we are trying to figure out also, if we're going to add interaction, let's make it meaningful and let's make it interesting, not just the same old, like, especially with like take that mechanisms. We don't want just to throw in cards that can hurt people. We want interaction to be important if it's going to be there. If the game doesn't have interaction or very minimal interaction, it's probably for good reason. So every game is different and you can't just say this game needs more interaction. You have to kind of weigh it up and what's the benefit and all that.
Totally. Yeah, this leads to a really interesting discussion as game designers about how much we're willing to repeat ourselves and to do things that we've done before. And it's actually not very clear-cut at all to me, because on one hand, we do want to innovate. We want the games will need to be different from each other, at least a little bit, right? And we want to bring something new to the design conversation, which I think Skara Brae has done. But there's also the sense that like if we completely innovate in every area, then people will have nothing that they understand or that they can bring to that experience. There's no familiarity there. And it's like the idea that like if a band creates a new album and it's a completely different sound, then they're not the band that you liked to begin with. And so I think there needs to be a sense of like your design signature coming through as well. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to do things that you've done before. Like some people might do that too much. It might go too far in the like, I've already seen this before. But if you have none of your design signature coming out or none of your familiar tried and true mechanisms coming out, then maybe there's nothing to latch on to there for players that have enjoyed your games in the past.
That's, interesting thought, because that's coming very much from an angle of like building a brand for yourself, even as a designer.
Right.
Like, do you want people to recognize your games? And maybe you do, but there are also reasons why you might not care for that. Maybe you don't care about building a brand or being recognized as a designer. You just like to experiment and have fun with tons of crazy ideas. And in that way, you probably won't get a big following of the same people, but you might get some massive hit that like goes off. So it's really about like different people and different motivations, I guess, behind why they design, or at least why they design a certain way. And I, you guys know me, I love making stuff that kind of belongs in a set or a universe or a trilogy. I just love that kind of stuff, and things having consistency. You'll see it all throughout our games where like every game in the medieval series has a different shaped worker for that trilogy or a different coin for that trilogy. And I don't know why, but that just satisfies me a lot to see that kind of consistency and patterns and things. So it really is about finding out what is your motivation as a designer. Do you need to build a brand, or don't you care for it?
Yeah, and I think there's something that can be quite nice about riffing on some of the same ideas, but just trying to develop them as well. Like it's not saying I'm just gonna spew out the same stuff that I did last time, but it's been like, okay, I'm a different person now. That game's come out. People have commented on it. Is there stuff? Are there things I can learn from also the feedback, the stuff that I've realized about the game after it's released, after the public's had it? And are there new ways I want to use some of those elements and build on top of them? And I think there's something quite great about that in a way. I think that is innovation because you're not copy and pasting, right? And I'm seeing that with the game that me and Sam are currently working on, which is very different to Chaos Order in many ways, but it's got a number of ideas that are the same.
Yeah.
A number of like design concepts which are being repeated, but the game is quite different. So I mean, it's in the same sort of genre of game, I guess. And I found that quite fun, being like, okay, this was a cool concept, but how can we build on top of that? How can we make it maybe not better, but different and unique to this game?
Yeah, so I would love to like go back to Legacy of You at some point and explore that space again. Not mechanically, like because Shipwrights and Skara Brae are already in that space, but more just like create a game like Legacy of You. I was wondering, Sam, if you got any games of our back catalogue that you'd like to kind of revisit, not like I did with North, Raiders versus Scythia, but any games that you think, I liked that kind of design space, I'd like to go back and design something else that's in a similar vein.
Yeah, there's a few answers to that. Like Paladins, I played that game and I'm like, man, this game has been received really well, and there's something quite unique about it. And getting to redo that would be really interesting. But then, like in terms of the feeling, Architects, like it's kind of like lightning in a bottle for me. I would love to make another Architects, but it's just so hard to make something like that, I don't know, unique, that works that well, that flows that beautifully as Architects. It sort of feels like a bit of a fluke. It'd be hard to design another Architects, I think, but I'd love to be able to. So me being me, the thing that I'm perhaps most interested in this game is the asymmetry. And Shem, you've put in what I think is 10 unique little player boards, or little like tiles that get added to the player boards. Now, why did you put these in the game? What does the asymmetry do? Like, just talk to us a little bit about the design decision around the asymmetry.
Yeah, so actually this came from an issue in the game, which is interesting. It's always fun when you have a problem to solve and then you find a solution which actually makes the game a whole lot better for other reasons. So the big problem I had was that players were creating too much bone in the game. If you cook a lot of the bigger animals, you create tons of bone. And you could just trade it away and you could use it for 5 of your tools. And that was it. So once you flip your 5 action tiles on the bottom, and once you start trading, or when you've done all your trading, what are you using bones for? There's no use for them in the game at all. They just kind of clog up your board. So I wanted to give away way where players could use their bones. And this is what brought in the last action. I think there were only 8 actions before this, and I can't remember how it came about, but I think there was one. I think the 10th action was like a copy action from memory. So there were 10 actions. One was go here and copy an action. That got replaced by having just a large meeple, which was Sam's suggestion. So with this kind of 10th action removed, I was like, well, I've got this new 10th action to fill. I know it's going to cost these resources to flip the tile over because it's already in the patterning that we've created. But what can this action be? And my first thought was, I want it to spend bones. Like, it's another way that players can just throw out all these bones that they're generating. So it ended up being that they could spend food or bone, any combination of two, just so it kind of baits players to spend their food a bit as well, which is kind of a fun part of the game. Like, can you survive it? Players often do that just because it's like, oh, the combination will help me out. I think I had just one, maybe one or maybe more kind of action lined up for that. I think I may have actually had 4, like from memory. So I think I had just like, there's one that lets you draw more cards, there's one that gets you more workers, that kind of thing. So there was just like 4 basic kind of actions that were asymmetric and allowed you to do more of one thing than the other players. And then from there, it was like, oh, can we do more? Can we create more of these things? And it was great because it means that the game's now suddenly more replayable because you've got new ways to play the game. There's new motivations each time you play with a different action tile. So it really brought a lot more to the game.
That kind of opens up the question of what does drive replay value in a game? Because you said adding these asymmetric tiles made the game more replayable. Is asymmetry necessary to make a game replayable, guys?
I think it's a good factor that can help. For sure. Like, not every game needs asymmetry. I think we've talked about this before in a previous episode, but asymmetry is great. In a way, it's a really good solve because it's great for multiplayer because it creates different interactions at the table and how these different asymmetries function. That's not such a feature in Skara Brae, but in other games. It's also great on the flip side for solo games because it gives those players more variety to choose from when they start the game.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is going to be one of these things that we're going to ask nearly every time that we play a game is to talk about the replayability, but not just to say, yes, it's replayable, no, it's not. And just realizing the fact that like replayability is made up of all these different factors that, yes, are very subjective and personal, but there are different things that can drive it. And so for me, asymmetry is one of the things that drives this game to be replayable for my taste. Of course, the core game has to be fun to want to play again. That's like the first thing that needs to be ticked off. But another thing is that like it's not long. It's 45 to 60 minutes, so you get a lot of fun in that short time, and that will mean that we will say again, let's play again if it was set up at the table. I think the other one is that idea of discovery. There you can lean hard into any one of the 4 columns, stacking all the cards in that column, and see what it feels like to have a ton of wood, or see what it feels like to have a ton of wheat, and try that strategy. So there's 4 strategies there for you, and then there's like balanced approaches. And then there's also like, well, how am I going to spend these resources? There are different ways. Am I going to go furnishing? Am I going to go crafting? Am I going to go trading? Or will I lean into my player power where there's 10 to explore? So I think the biggest driver for replayability for me is the exploration of different paths and strategies to try and win.
I think Shem said like in our last podcast that replayability means the game's fun, right? If a game's fun, you want to play it again. So I think you kind of said, that's one of the aspects you said, Sam, but I think that is the whole aspect, right? And asymmetry adds some fun to it, maybe, maybe not to every game, but is it adding fun? I think, to be honest, I think this game is very replayable because I think I've only played it about 3 or 4 times in the final or mostly final version. And I don't even feel like I've scratched the surface of things to do in the game. It does seem like it is a simple game in some ways compared to other Garphill games to understand and to play, and it has kind of a very nice feeling while you're playing it. But at the same time, there's so many ways, I think, to try and score points in the game, which is an ironic thing to say because I think it's a game with there's only really a few areas where you score points compared to some other games. So there's not point salad everywhere. But there's so many ways to try and get to those points. And like, for example, you were talking, Sam, about just like spamming one column. Like, I don't think I've ever spammed one column. Like, I've never tried that play style before.
Gotta do it.
Yeah, I need to try it next time. So I think there's so many play styles that could work that I haven't even touched yet. So I'm quite impressed by that factor there, considering that it's not a super complex game. It's not one of the heavier games in the Garphill line.
Yeah, and it's not a game about chaining like you'd see in, say, Hadrian's Wall, but it has a similar satisfaction to the resource management. So you're just like, it sounds strange, but because there's a lot of planning and thought that goes into it, but sometimes you're playing, you're going, oh, I just created some stuff. Like, what do I do with this stuff? So you gain a card, you you spit out some resources, then you got to figure out how to use those resources. So sometimes it feels like, as a player, you're just like pushing buttons and things start popping out. Not to say it's chaotic in any way, but that's kind of how it can feel when all these things are, oh, suddenly I've got some wool, now I've got some wood, and what am I doing with this stuff? And you're kind of reacting quite a lot of time. But as you learn the game more, you realize, oh, there's way more decisions underlying all this stuff, and every action I take has consequences. But that's a big fun part for me, I guess, in playing the game. And I can talk about the game as a third person, but I do enjoy the like I said, the puzzle type thing where it's almost like mastery of the game, like trying to figure out how am I going to play this as perfectly as possible this time. Like that satisfaction feeling you get when your slider is all the way down the left side, you've got just enough food to feed your people and no wasted resources. Similar thing we get in Architect Sim, when if you finish the game with no resources, it's like, job well done. Like you built everything, no waste.
Yeah, hard out.
Or if you end with a ton of stone or wood or clay, you're like, oh darn, I could have used this for something. I quite like that mastery, that kind of feeling of like, I want to try and achieve this as best as I can.
And I think the asymmetric powers actually add to that, because each time I play with different power, I'm like, how can I use this power to the maximum ability? And maybe also, how do I use it but not overuse it? Because I think you can also sometimes get trapped into using them too much.
Definitely.
Guilty.
And not get other things that you need. So, like, how can I optimally play with this power? And I know that other people have different ones, so they're going to be trying to do that with theirs. So it's quite an interesting puzzle as well.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting thing you just said about the don't overuse the power, because that is definitely a feature of Skara Brae. If you just try and go heavy on your thing that you're told to do, you will probably fail. Yeah, it's going to make you just overproduce or get way too much of one thing or not get enough points in certain areas. So, and that was quite a hard thing for testing, because balancing a game like this is quite hard, because you've got different ways to play this game even without the asymmetry. And then you add in the asymmetry and you go, are these balanced? You got all these factors like, did I play a certain way? Did the power have any contribution at all to my score? How much did I lean into that power versus not lean into it? It's a really crazy thing, and it's hard, definitely to balance, maybe more so than a lot of games were designed recently, for me at least, where I basically had to get to a point where I was like, I hope it's balanced. Like, from my testing, you kind of look for these big outliers of like, how did someone just score 70 points? Like, what did that? That's crazy. But when you're kind of scoring in this, in a way, 35 to 55 range most of the time, and all scores usually land around the 40 range, and there's no big blowouts or really terrible games, and you can't figure out why, then you're like, well, I guess it's kind of balanced. That's roughly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, some games will feel punishing, or like hard games where there's a high skill ceiling and all of that, they'll feel punishing based on tightness. Like, you only just have enough resources to do X and Y. But you kind of like, this game is hard to do really well. Like, there's a lot of room to improve over the systems and mastery and stuff. But you take the complete opposite approach, which is really interesting. Like, you allow people to be greedy, and you sort of play on people's greed. You want all those resources? Bro, just have them. Here you go. I'll make it easier for you next time. Have more. And you have to decide when to exercise self-control and to clean it up and to not take all of those resources, which I think is a really cool thing. Instead of just going like super tight on resources and only allowing players to hold 8, you've got this massive board where you can hold, I don't know, it looks like about 30 odd or maybe more, and go for it. Like, you'll feel powerful with those resources, but you're producing a lot of poop, and no one wants to live in poop.
And I think the clever thing there is the action to clean up, right, requires different sorts of resources.
Yeah.
So if you are spamming one resource, you're like, okay, how do I clean up now?
You have to kind of go out of your way to get more resources to do the cleaning, which is always like a struggle in the game. If there's the clean action, there's at its bare minimum, there's 4 resources you can use, and you can't use more than 1 of each. So, if you want to do the maximum clean, you got to get the 4 different things to clean. The amount of times I have like 2 of them, like I've got like a wood and a seaweed. Like, all right, if I could just clean now and clean twice, or if I go here and get a barley first, then I could clean 6 times. But like, is that actually effective? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a good decision.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion about Skara Brae, but we'd love to hear from you. Jump on the Garphill Games Discord and let us know in the podcast channel if you've played Skara Brae. How did you find the resource management system? And what is your favourite way another game handles resources, and why? Alright guys, final question. Which board game would you prefer as a video game, and why?
So I've got two answers. One is a hypothetical and one is based on experience. So the one based on experience, I really like the digital implementation of Codenames. I played it online during the pandemic and it was fantastic. There are two reasons why I think it works really well on digital format. One is that like when you're the spy master, I always feel conscious that I'm looking at the very card to try and figure out what my clue is going to be, and that people will track my eye movement and then know which ones I'm trying to avoid or trying to give clues for. I'm not sure if that's a thing, but I feel like it's a thing, and I feel a little bit nervous about that. Like I don't want to make it too obvious what I'm looking at. So the digital implementation doesn't have that problem, but also the digital implementation has like a history of all the given clues and the numbers, so you can actually look up and see what the previous clues were. There's no memory element to that, and I think that that's fantastic. It just makes it a little bit more usable. So really recommend Codenames. It's also easier to set up and to start a new game and shuffle and all of that, and you don't have to also move around the table to change teams, like your seating positions and stuff for the spy masters. So Codenames, fantastic. The hypothetical is Welcome to the Moon. It's a very interesting roll and write game that has 8 different boards, 8 different essentially games that you can play using the same standard system. But then there's also a campaign mode which changes the rules up again. And just still being able to play that as a video game where it tracks all the rules changes, it makes it really clear what the rules for each of the 8 boards are, would be really great, like having tooltips and stuff like that. So Welcome to the Moon.
So my game is also from experience, actually, would be Nidavellir. Now, this is because I first played it on the famous board game arena with Sam and another friend of ours, Kahu, and we had a really fun time. Played it, I don't know how many times in a row. It was really good. And so I went out and bought the game, physical copy, and then I set up the game and was like, man, this is a lot of work, like constructing this chest with all the coins in it, like all the cards. And so, I mean, the game is really a fun game. Like, I think it's a great game. But just for the kind of how long the game is, how complex the game is, the setup just seems way too much. And so I would much prefer to just jump on, have the game start instantly, and play it with my friends online. So, yeah, my game would be Nidavellir.
Yeah, mine would be quite a similar story for me as well, actually, Zach. And I wonder how much of that is because we played the digital versions first. If we had played the analog first, would we have like enjoyed that for the not necessarily nostalgia, but just the charm of the physical version first? But maybe we ruined ourselves. So I first played Mystic Vale on Steam a couple years ago, or 3 years ago maybe. And like I know the game has got its issues, but it's got a real charm to it that I love. So I played that a lot digitally. Really enjoyed it. Just as a solo game, especially, like you don't mind the swing of the luck so much. I'm assuming, I never played it multiplayer, but I'm assuming that luck factor would be quite frustrating in multiplayer. So I'd played it digitally, really liked it, and I thought, I'm going to go buy that game and all the expansions. But the game wasn't available in New Zealand at that point. There was a Essential Edition coming out like later that year. So I saw all the expansions on sale at a local store. So I'll grab the expansions now, all that stuff. I got the big collector's box thing, like in preparation for the base game to show up. And then I got it, and I played it quite a few times, because you've got with that game, it adds lots of extra cards with the expansions, but you can't just mix and mingle them so easily. You kind of create sets of versions to play the game with. I think I played through 5 or 6 different sets of the game. And I enjoyed playing it, but now that I've kind of played through it, I'm like, I don't think I'd want to play it in person over playing it digitally. Just because there's like tons of cards, really small text. To play it properly solo, you kind of have to have it sideways to fit, to see all the cards. So you're kind of reading sideways most of the time. That's how I had it set up anyway, to be practical. And then you've got sleeving thing is cool. It's really cool. But then you've got to unsleeve at the end of the game. Get all your cards out of the sleeves and sort them again. And the plastic kind of cards can't stick together slightly. And I don't ever see myself wanting to play it multiplayer, because how is ever going to see all those cards around the table? Maybe 2-player would work fine, but any more than that, I'm like, I don't think I want to play this with 3 or 4 people. So, but I would hands down play it right now digitally, because it's fun and enjoyable. So that would be my one. Mystic Vale, great game, but digital might be better.
Thanks for listening to the Lens and Veil podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Garphill Games. You can follow Garphill on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, and YouTube, or by joining the Garphill Discord server.